You can always tell when a man has been beaten by the land. It isn't the dust on his boots or the cracks in his hands. It's the way he stops looking up at the sky. He stops hopping for rain because hope started costing him more than the drought ever did. I had stopped looking up by the spring of that year. So had everyone in the valley. We walked with our chins down and our eyes on the dead dirt, like we were already practicing for our own funerals. And then one morning I saw a woman on her knees in the worst piece of ground in 3 counties. Soil so dead it had gone gray, soil that had killed every seed I ever trusted to it. And she was pressing something small and dark into the cracks with her thumb, one at a time, slow, like she was tucking children into bed. I thought she was mad. I told her so, more or less. I have written down a lot of things in my life that turned out wrong. That one sits near the top. This is the story of the worst year I ever lived through, and the woman who refused to let the ground have the last word. I wrote most of it down as it happened, in a leather book I kept tied with a bootlace, because I am the kind of fool who needs to see a thing in ink before he'll believe it was real. Read it slow. She did everything slow. I think that was the whole secret. I keep a logbook. I have kept one since I was 19, when my father died owing money to 3 men, and I decided I would never again be unsure of where a single dollar of mine had gone. So I write things down. Cattle counts, weather, the price of nails, the day my wife left, and the day I stopped pretending I didn't know why. I mention this so you understand the kind of man I was when Dotest came over the ridge. Not a dreamer, not a believer in much. A man who counts. A man who needs the numbers to add up before he'll let his heart move at all. That spring the numbers did not add up. They hadn't added up for 2 years. The drought came the way real disasters always come, not with thunder but with quiet. The first year we said it's just a dry one. We've had dry ones. The creek shrank to a brown thread. We watched it the way you watch a sick animal you love, telling yourself it'll turn the corner any day now. The second year the thread became a memory. The cottonwoods along the bank went yellow in July and stayed that way, and by August they were dropping leaves like they'd given up on the whole idea of being trees. By the spring I'm telling you about, the third spring, the valley had become a place that ate things. It ate the Hendersons' herd. It ate old Prute's mind. He started talking to his dead brother and walking the fence line at night in his union suit until his daughter took him east. It ate my neighbor Calloway, who put a rope over his barn beam in March. And I am the one who found him. And I will not write more about that here because I wrote enough about it that night, and my hands shook so bad the words came out crooked. I had 41 head of cattle left out of 190. I was selling them off in 2s and 3s at prices that made me want to spit, because a dying man can't be choosy about who buys his blood. I had a well that gave brown water in the morning and nothing by noon. And I had a logbook full of subtractions, page after page, my whole life draining out one entry at a time. So you'll forgive me if I wasn't in the mood for miracles the day I saw her. I'd ridden out to the south parcel, the dead acres. We called them the ground nobody would touch. It had gone bad even before the drought, salt poison from an old spring that had run mineral and ruined it years back. Gray dirt, gray and fine like ash, and so packed in places you could have struck a match on it. Nothing grew there, not even the mesquite that grows out of solid rock everywhere else in this country. The dead acres were the one piece of land I owned that the drought couldn't make worse, because there was nothing left to take. I rode out there because I was thinking of selling it. I had a buyer, a railroad man, soft hands, who wanted a flat run for a spur line and didn't care that the soil was poison. I told myself I was riding out to look it over. The truth is I was riding out to say goodbye to it, the way you do with land, even land you hate. My father had bought those acres. He'd believed in them once. I wanted to stand on them one more time before I signed them away to a man who'd never know their name. And there she was. She was kneeling at the far edge, near where the old salt spring used to weep. A woman, maybe 50, maybe older, it was hard to say. The way the sun out here ages everyone past guessing. She wore a faded calico dress on the color of dust, and her gray-streaked hair was tied back with a strip of cloth. Beside her sat a flat woven basket, and in the basket were seeds. Dark, hard little seeds, smaller than corn, packed in clothes. She was planting them in the dead ground. One at a time. She'd press her thumb into the gray dirt, make a little hole, drop a seed, close it over, smooth it flat. Then she'd shift 6 inches and do it again. She didn't look up when my horse came near, though she must have heard us 40 feet off on hardpan. A horse is not a quiet thing. She just kept on. Thumb, seed, smooth, thumb, seed, smooth. I sat my horse and watched her for a while. I'm not proud of what I felt. I felt the particular meanness that comes over a beaten man when he sees someone doing something hopeful. It's an ugly thing in a person, and I had it bad that year. Look at this, I thought. Look at this poor fool wasting good seed on dead ground. At least I know my land is dying. She doesn't even know yet. "Ma'am," I finally said, "that's my land you're on." She finished the seed she was holding, pressed it in, smoothed it over, no rush before she answered. "I know whose land it is." Her English was careful and even, each word set down separate, like she was planting those too. "It was nobody's land for a long time before it was your father's." That stopped me a little. "You knew my father?" "I knew this spring." She nodded toward the dry weep of salt. "When it ran sweet, before they dug the mine upstream and turned it bitter. I came here as a girl with my mother to gather here, long before fences." She looked up at me for the first time, and her eyes were dark and steady and not the least bit ashamed of being where she was. "I am not here to take anything from you. There is nothing here to take. You know this. That is why you let it die." I didn't have an answer for that, so I did what men do when they're caught flat-footed by the truth. I got contrary. "That ground's poison," I said. "Salt killed. Nothing's grown there in 20 years. You're throwing your seed away." "Yes," she agreed. "Nothing has grown here, that is true." She went back to her planting. Thumb, seed, smooth. Many true things were true until they were not. Her name was Dotest. She told me that day, though it took me a week to learn to say it right, and even then she'd correct me with a small dip of her chin, patient, the way you correct a child who's trying. She was Apache. Chiricahua, she told me later, though that word carried weight I didn't understand the size of at the time. I knew the shape of the history the way most white men in that country knew it, which is to say, I knew the parts that flattered us and was comfortably ignorant of the rest. I knew there had been wars. I knew there had been the trains east, the ones that carried whole peoples to Florida and Alabama to die of fevers in a wet heat their lungs had never been built for. I knew, in the vague way you know about a fire in another town, that terrible things had happened, and I had let myself not think too hard about them, because thinking about them would have asked something of me. Dotest had been on one of those trains. As a young woman, she told me this much later on a cold night by a fire, in the flat voice people use for the things that are too big to be said any other way, that she had gone east in a rail car with the doors barred, that she had buried people in ground that wasn't theirs, that of the family she'd left this valley with as a girl she had come back, decades later, alone. An old woman returning to a place that had become a stranger's ranch. Returning to Poison Spring, she remembered running sweet. But I didn't know any of that the first day. The first day I just knew there was a stubborn old woman planting seeds in my dead dirt, and that something about the sureness of her hands bothered me in a way I couldn't put down. "What is it?" I asked her before I rode off. "What were you planting?" She held one of the seeds up between her thumb and finger so I could see it. Dark, almost black, hard as a pebble, with a faint pattern on it like a thing that had been carved very small. "Corn," she said. I laughed, I couldn't help it. "That's not corn. Corn's yellow, corn's twice that size." "This is corn," she said, and there was no offense in it, just a flat correction. "It is older than your corn. My grandmother's grandmother carried these seeds. They have crossed mountains. They have crossed deserts. They went east on the train, sewn into the hem of a dress, because a woman I knew decided they should not be allowed to die even if we were." She closed her fist around the seed. "Your corn is soft. It was bread soft by people who never knew thirst. This corn knows thirst. This corn remembers it. I want to tell you that her words landed on me like prophecy. They didn't. I rode home thinking she was a sad old woman keeping herself busy with a hopeless task, and that there was a kindness in letting her do it since it cost me nothing. The dead acres were dead. Let her plant her pebbles. The railroad man wouldn't be out till fall. That's what I wrote in my logbook that night, more or less. I have the page in front of me as I write this, years later, and I can see the man I was in those crooked lines. A patchy woman planting old corn on the south parcel, poisoned ground. Won't come to anything. Let her be. Won't come to anything. I told you, I've written down a lot of things that turned out wrong. I didn't ride out to the dead acres again for almost 2 weeks. I had no reason to. I had cattle to nurse and water to ration and a buyer to put off and 1,000 small dyings to tend to closer to home. The drought made every day a kind of bargaining, this much water to the horses, this much to the last of the chickens, this much to myself, and the math never once came out in anyone's favor. But she stayed in my mind the way a splinter stays, the sureness of her. I'd be hauling brown water up out of my failing well, my back screaming, my hope long gone, and I'd think of her thumb pressing seeds into ground I knew for a fact was dead, and I'd feel that meanness rise in me again. She'll see, I'd think. She'll come to nothing, same as the rest of us, and then maybe I won't feel so alone in it. It shames me to write that. But I promised myself when I started this account that I'd write the true thing or none of it. And the true thing is that misery wanted company, and I was no better than my misery that year. When I finally rode out to the south parcel, it was because the railroad man had sent a letter moving up his timetable, and I needed to walk the ground again to settle in my own mind whether I could really sell my father's acres to a stranger. I rode out at dawn, before the heat could climb up out of the dirt and start eating at a man's good sense. I almost didn't see it at first. The light was low and gold, and it does strange things to gray ground at that hour. But then I reined up hard, and my horse stamped, and I sat there in the saddle with my mouth open like a man who's seen something he has no shelf to put on. Green. In the dead acres. In the gray, salt-poisoned, 20 years barren dead acres, where not even mesquite would root, a row of green, small, hardly more than a hand high. Thin spears of green pushing up out of cracks I'd have sworn couldn't grow a curse, let alone a crop. A long, crooked line of them, marching out from the dry weep of the old spring, each one no bigger than a child's finger. Corn. Her corn. Up. Alive. Growing in ground I had personally pronounced dead with all the certainty of a man who'd never once been right about anything that mattered. I got down off my horse. I walked along that crooked green line slow, almost afraid, the way you walk up on something you don't trust to be real. I crouched. I touched one of the little shoots with a finger as careful as I knew how to be. It was real. Tough already, fibrous, the leaf edges faintly sharp. A small, hard, living thing, standing up out of the gray in the cool of the morning like it had every right in the world to be there. I knelt in the dirt of my own dead land, and I felt something move in my chest that I had not felt in 2 years, and I did not have a name for it, and that frightened me more than the drought ever had. Because I had spent 2 years carefully killing every hope I owned, on purpose, one entry at a time, because a hope that dies slow is the cruelest thing a man can carry. And here was this old woman's corn putting a hope back into me whether I wanted it or not. I didn't want it. I swear to you I didn't want it. Hope had cost me Calloway hanging in his barn. Hope had cost me a wife. I had made my peace with the dying because at least the dying was honest. At least the dying didn't lie to you the way hope does. And now there was green in the dead acres, and I knelt there and, I'll write it plain, I cried. First time since the day in Calloway's barn. Knelt in the gray dirt of the worst land I owned and cried over 6 inches of stubborn corn like a child, like a fool, like a man who didn't know yet how much more it was going to cost him to start believing again. She found me like that. I hadn't heard her come. It surprised you, she said, not a question. I got to my feet too fast and turned away to wipe my face, the way men do, pretending at dust. Didn't think it would take. Most of it didn't. She crouched by the row and ran her fingers down the green of one shoot, gentle the way you touch a horse's nose. I planted 400 seeds, maybe 40 have come up, maybe 30 will live to be tall, maybe 10 will give back seed. She looked up at me. But 10 is not nothing. 10 is everything. 10 is enough to plant 100 next year. 100 is enough to plant 1,000 the year after. She stood and her knees cracked and she pressed a hand to her back the way old people do, and in that small human gesture I saw the whole weight of her age and what she was asking of it. I will not live to see the 1,000. That is all right. Seeds are patient. They have waited longer than my whole life inside a hem of cloth. They can wait a little more. I looked at the crooked green line, and I did the only thing I knew how to do with a thing I didn't understand. I started to count. 40 up, I said. Out of 400, that's 1 in 10. That's a terrible rate. You know that. Any seed man would call that a failure. Yes, she said, and she smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen her smile, and it cracked her whole weathered face open like the ground after rain. A failure, a terrible, terrible failure. She picked up her basket. And it is more living corn than has grown on this ground in 20 years. So you tell me, rancher, what is the number for a thing that should have been impossible and was only nearly so? Where do you write that in your little book? I didn't have an answer. I have spent years looking for it, and I'm not sure I have one yet. I went home that night and I did not write in my logbook. First night in 20 years I didn't. I sat at my table with the lamp low and the book open and the pen in my hand, and I couldn't make the numbers come because the numbers wouldn't hold what I'd seen. 40 out of 400. I could write that. But it was a lie, or at least it wasn't the truth. The way a man's height is true, but tells you nothing about whether he'd carry you out of a fire. So I sat there with the empty page, and somewhere out past the dark in the worst dirt I owned, a row of stubborn old corn that remembered thirst stood up in the cool and grew. Just a little, just enough. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about what she'd said, that she wouldn't live to see the 1,000 and that it was all right. I kept turning that over, because I had spent 2 years unable to look at the sky, unable to plan past the next sale, the next ration, the next subtraction. I had made my world the size of my own dying. And here was a woman planting a harvest she'd never eat, for people she'd never meet, in ground that had been stolen from her, in a country that had marched her family east to die. And she was smiling about a failure rate that would have broken any farmer I knew. I didn't understand it. I want to be honest about that. I didn't understand her, not that night, maybe not ever all the way. But something in me had cracked open along with the gray ground, and the green was getting in. And I knew, the way you know a storm is coming by the smell before you ever see the cloud, that my careful, counted, beaten-down life was about to be changed by an old woman's corn, and there wasn't a thing I could do to stop it. I didn't know yet what it would cost, her or me. I didn't know the worst of the drought was still ahead. I didn't know about the railroad man and what he'd offer, or what I'd have to choose. I didn't know that before the year was out I'd have to decide what kind of man I'd been all along, with everything I had riding on the answer. But I knew this much. Lying awake that night with the lamp guttering, and the empty logbook page glowing white in the dark. The ground wasn't dead. It had only been waiting for someone stubborn enough to disagree. By the middle of June, the corn was up to my knee. I want you to sit with how strange that sentence is. By the middle of June, in the 3rd year of a drought that had killed grown trees in the worst poisoned ground in 3 counties, the corn was up to my knee. Not all of it. Dot Est had been right about her numbers. Most of the seedlings had withered in the first hard weeks, gone brown and curled and lain back down into the gray. But the ones that lived didn't just live. They thrived in a way that made no sense to anyone who knew that land, including me, and I'd known it my whole life. I started riding out there every morning. I told myself it was to keep an eye on the south parcel before the sale. That was a lie I let myself believe for about a week before I gave it up. The truth was I went because the corn was the only thing in my life that was getting bigger instead of smaller, and a man who spent 2 years subtracting will walk a long way at dawn to watch something add. Datest was always already there. I never once arrived before her, no matter how early I rose, and I rose with the dark. She'd be moving down the rows in the gray light, doing the small, endless work that I came to understand was the whole of farming and that I, with all my counting, had never properly respected. Pulling the few weeds tough enough to compete, mounding dirt around the base of each stalk, carrying water up from the seep one gourd at a time, and pouring it slow at the roots so not a drop went to waste on a leaf. That was the thing that undid my disbelief in the end, not the corn, the water. Because there was no water. That was the whole shape of our suffering. There was no water anywhere in that valley, my well browned by noon, the creek a memory, men selling their souls for a tank of it. And yet her corn drank. I watched her one morning and finally asked the question that had been gnawing me. "Where," I said, "are you getting the water?" She didn't stop moving down the row. "The spring." "The spring's dead. It's been salt dead 20 years. The top of it is bitter," she said. "Salt sits on top. It is heavy and it is lazy and it sits." She crouched at the old wheat where I'd never seen anything but a crust of white mineral and a damp gray stain. She dug there. I saw it now, a narrow pit lined with flat stones down past the crust. And in the bottom of it, where she'd gone below the lazy salt, there was water, not much, a slow gathering, but clear. Below the salt the spring still runs sweet. It always did. The mind poisoned the mouth of it. It could not reach the heart. She dipped her gourd, careful not to stir the bottom. Most things that look dead are only poisoned at the mouth. I stood there and felt the slow burn of being a fool in front of someone patient. 20 years. 20 years that seep had sat on land my father had despaired of, that I had despaired of, and not one of us had ever thought to dig below the bitterness to see if there was something sweet underneath. We'd looked at the white crust and pronounced the whole thing dead, the way you do, the way it's easier to do, and we'd walked away and let it sit. I wrote that in my logbook that night, not the numbers, the lesson. Salt sits on top, heavy and lazy, dig below it. It's the only entry in 20 years of logbooks that is an account of something, and I've gone back and read it more times than all the rest combined. The valley found out about the corn in July. It was bound to. You can't grow a green field in a dead country and expect it to stay secret. Green pulls the eye in a brown land the way a fire does at night. First it was the mescal boy, riding fence for what was left of the Henderson place, who came on the south parcel by accident and went home and told his mother, who told everyone. Then it was a slow trickle of them, the beaten people of the valley, riding out to my dead acres to stand at the edge and look at the impossible thing and not say much. I'll tell you how a dying valley looks at a field of living corn. It looks at it the way the starving look at bread through a window, with hunger, yes, but with something meaner riding under the hunger. Because a man who has accepted that his land is dead has made a hard, costly peace with that, and the sight of someone else's land living can feel less like hope than like an accusation. If she can grow it, why can't you? What's wrong with you, that you let your ground die? I knew that feeling. I'd felt it myself the first day, riding up on her. So I watched it move through the others and I understood it, and I watched it curdle in some of them into something worse. Old Garrity was the worst of them. Garrity had lost more than most, 2 sons gone west looking for work, a wife dead of the coughing fever that thrives in dust, a herd reduced to bones. Grief had hollowed him out and filled him back up with bile. He rode out to the parcel in July and sat his horse at the edge of the green for a long time, and then he spat in the dirt and said, loud enough to carry, "Which corn?" Just that, "Which corn?" And he rode off. But words like that have weight in a frightened place. They settle into the cracks the way the dust does. And I watched a few of the others nod slow, the way people nod at a thing they don't believe but find useful, because it gave them somewhere to put their hunger and their shame. Better the corn be witchcraft than that they'd given up too soon on their own dead ground. Datest heard it. She heard all of it. She kept mounding dirt around her stalks and never once looked up, and that night by the small fire she let me sit at, she said only, "They called us worse on the trains east. A name is just a stone someone throws because their hands are empty. You can let it hit you, or you can let it fall." "You ought to tell them," I said. "About the spring, about below the salt, you could teach them. They could do it too. Every parcel in this valley's got some seep, some low ground. You could save the whole." "I have tried to teach people things before," she said, "and there was something old and tired in it, something that had nothing to do with that summer. When I came back here, I went to the agency. I told the man there about the old crops, the corn that knows thirst, the way to dig below the salt, the way my people farmed this country for longer than there have been counties to call it." She moved a coal with a stick. "He wrote it in a book, the way you write things in a book, and then he closed the book. And nothing came of it. People do not want to learn a thing from the person they have decided is beneath them. It cracks something they have built their comfort on." She looked at me across the fire, and the flames moved in her dark eyes. "You learned it. Do you know why you learned it?" "I didn't." "Because you had already lost everything," she said. "A full man cannot learn from below him. Only an empty one can. The drought emptied you. That is the one gift it gave you. Do not waste it." The railroad man came in early August. His name was Mr. Pell, and he came in a buggy with a driver, and he wore a linen suit that the dust had not been allowed to touch, which told me everything about how he moved through the world. He had soft hands and a soft voice, and the particular patience of a man who has never once had to wonder whether he'd eat. He found me at the ranch house, declined my brown water with a polite little wince, and laid out his offer on my own table like he was doing me a mercy. It was a good offer. I'll be honest about that, because the whole weight of what came after sits on how good it was. He wanted the south parcel and the strip of low ground running off it, wanted it for the spur line, flat ground, didn't care about the salt. And the price he named was enough to clear my father's old debts, settle what I owed, buy water rights up valley that might carry my remaining cattle through to spring. It was, in plain terms, the difference between my dying and my living. It was a rope thrown to drowning man. There was only the one thing. "The acreage I'm purchasing," Pell said, sliding a surveyor's map across my table, soft finger tracing a line, "includes the southeast corner, the old spring. We'll need to grade the whole run flat, of course. Fill the seep, can't have soft ground under a rail bed." He smiled the smile of a man who'd never in his life had to mean it. "I understand there's been some agricultural activity out there. A squatter, I'm told. That'll need to be resolved before we close. Naturally, I'll leave that to you. Your land, your trespasser." He tapped the map. 30 days, can you have it cleared by then?" I looked at the line his soft finger had drawn. It ran straight through the green, straight through the corn that knew thirst, straight through the spring that still ran sweet below the salt, the heart of it that the mine couldn't reach, and Pell would fill it, grade it, lay iron over it, and it would be dead in the only way that ground had never managed to die, dead under 100 tons of rail and gravel, dead for good. 30 days, have it cleared, your trespasser. I told him I'd think on it. He didn't like that. Men like Pell don't expect a drowning man to think. But he left me the map, and the buggy rolled off in its own little cloud of dust, and I sat at my table with the surveyor's line in front of me and the lamp burning low, and I did not write a single thing in my logbook that night either, because I could see exactly what the entry would be. Sold south parcel to railroad, cleared the squatter, debts settled, cattle saved. The numbers would add up. For the first time in 3 years, the numbers would finally beautifully add up. And it would cost me only the corn and the spring, and the old woman who taught me the one true thing I'd learned in 2 years of dying. And what was she to me, really? A trespasser. Pell's word, not mine, but it sat there on the table being true. She had no claim. The law was all on my side. I could clear her tomorrow, and no court in the territory would say a word against me. I sat with that. I want you to know I sat with it honestly. I didn't dismiss it out of hand the way a better man might have. I am not a better man. I'm a man who counts, and the count was clear. her corn, her spring, her smile that cracked the ground open against my whole life, my father's debts, my cattle, my survival. And God help me, for the better part of that night the numbers won. I rode out at dawn meaning to tell her. That's the part I've never been able to soften in the retelling, and I won't soften it here. I rode out to the dead acres in the gray light with the surveyor's map folded in my coat, meaning to tell Dottis that I'd sold the ground out from under her corn, that she had to go, that I was sorry but a man has to live. I'd built the whole speech on the ride out. I'd practiced the part where I said I'm sorry in a way that would let me ride off feeling I'd done it kindly. She was in the rows when I came up. The corn was past my waist now, tasseling, the first silk showing pale at the tops of the ears that were just beginning to swell. She was moving down the line in the dawn the way she always was, and there was a stillness to her work that I'd come to know, and when she heard my horse she straightened and pressed her hand to her back and turned to me, and she smiled. She smiled at me. After Garrity's witch talk, after the valley's curdled hunger, after a life I was only beginning to understand the size of, she turned and saw me coming and smiled like I was a thing she was glad to see. And I couldn't say it. The speech I'd built died in my throat. I sat my horse like a coward with the map folded over my heart, and I couldn't get a word of it out. She read it on me anyway, she always read me. "You have come to tell me something hard," she said, not a question. She set down her gourd. "Sit. Tell me by the fire. Hard things go down easier sitting." So I got down and I sat at the cold morning ash of her little fire, and I took the map out of my coat and I unfolded it and I laid it on the ground between us. I put my finger on the line, the soft straight line that ran through the green, and I told her what it was. The railroad, the price, the 30 days, the gradding, the fill, the iron, the spring buried for good. She looked at the map for a long time. She didn't touch it. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, the way it was for the things too big to be said any other way. "And you," she said, "what do you want to do?" "I want to live," I said. It came out of me raw, more honest than I'd meant. "That's the truth of it. I'm dying out here, Dottis. My cattle are dying. My well's near gone. That money is the only rope anybody's thrown me in 3 years. I'd be a fool to let it go for—" I stopped. "For corn," she finished, quiet, "for an old woman's corn." "I didn't say that." "You did not have to." She was quiet a while. The dawn came up gold over the green. Then she said something I have carried every day since. "When they took us east on the trains," she said, "we were told it was for our own good. They said the land here could not hold us. They said we were a dying people on a dying ground, and the kind thing, the practical thing, was to move us where we could be managed. And the men who said it believed they were being merciful. Some of them wept, telling us. They had built a count in their heads, you understand. So many of us, so little water, so little land, the numbers did not add up, they said. And so they cleared us, the way you would clear a trespasser, and they felt they had done a hard kindness." She looked at me. "I buried my mother in Florida ground. I buried my son in Alabama. I buried more people than I will name, in earth that was not ours, because some good man with soft hands decided the numbers did not add up and that we were the part of the sum that had to go." The fire was cold between us. The corn moved a little in the dawn wind, the new silk catching gold. "I'm not telling you this to chain you," she said. "The ground is yours. The law is yours. You may clear me and your numbers will add up and you will live, and one day you will be an old man and you will have a leather book full of every dollar you ever saved, and somewhere in it in your own hand will be the line where you cleared the trespasser and saved your cattle." She stood, slow, knees cracking, hand to her back. "I only ask that you write it true, whatever you choose. Do not let yourself call it a hard kindness. Call it what it is. That much you owe the ground, even if you owe me nothing." And she picked up her gourd, and she went back down the rows to water her corn, leaving me alone by the cold fire with the surveyor's map and 30 days, and the whole weight of my own life pressing down on a choice I did not know how to make. I rode home. I didn't write that night either. The logbook sat open and the page stayed white, and outside in the dark the corn that knew thirst kept growing toward a harvest that one of us was going to have to bury or save. I had 30 days. I'd already wasted one of them learning that I was the kind of man who could ride out to do a cruel thing and build a kind speech to ride home on. I didn't know yet what kind of man I'd be by day 30. Neither, I think, did she. I spent 22 of my 30 days not deciding. That's the part nobody tells you about a hard choice, that the not deciding is its own kind of deciding, and a coward's kind, because every day you don't choose is a day the easier answer settles deeper into the cracks like dust. I rode out to the corn each morning. I watched the ears swell and the silk go from pale to brown. I watched Dotest tend it. And I let Pell's map sit folded in my coat against my heart, and I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, when the truth was I was waiting to become the kind of man for whom the cruel thing would feel easy. I was waiting to be worse. It didn't take the waiting. That's the only mercy in it. Every day I rode out meaning to find that the choice had made itself, and every day the corn was a little taller and a little more alive, and every day the not deciding cost me a little more sleep, and by the 22nd day I was a man worn so thin by his own indecision that he couldn't carry it one more sunrise. What broke it wasn't nobility. I want to be honest to the end. It wasn't that I finally understood Dotest, or that her words about the trains finally moved through me and turned me good. What broke it was smaller and meaner and more human than that. It was the logbook. I sat down on the 22nd night and I made myself do the thing she'd asked. I made myself write the entry as it would have to be written if I sold. I dipped the pen and I wrote, sold South Parcel to Railroad, cleared, and I stopped because the next word was going to be a name, not the squatter, not the trespasser. Those were Pell's words, soft words built to let a man not see what he was doing. If I was going to write it true the way she'd asked, I had to write the name. Cleared Dotest. I looked at those two words on the page in my own hand, and I could not make myself follow them with another. Because I knew, sitting there, exactly what kind of man kept a leather book with that line in it. I'd find him, years on, an old man reading his own true accounting, and I'd have to live in the same body as him. And I found, finally, at the bottom of all my counting, that there was one sum I could not bear to make add up. I tore the page out. First page I ever tore from a logbook in my life. I held it to the lamp flame and watched it curl, and the room got very quiet, and I understood that I had just chosen to lose nearly everything I had left, and that I felt not happy, not noble, but lighter, the way you feel when you finally set down a thing you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was a weight and not a part of your own body. Pell was not gracious about it. I rode in to tell him on the 23rd day. I'd expected him to be angry, and he was, in the soft, cold way of his kind, no shouting, just a tightening around the eyes and a sudden departure of all his patience. He told me I was a fool. He told me the offer would not come again, that the spur would go up the East Valley now, through the Garrity's ruin and the dead Henderson place, and that I'd watch from my poisoned ground as the men who'd taken his money rebuilt their lives and I clung to mine. He may have been right. He probably was right. I rode home from town having traded my survival for 2 words I couldn't bring myself to write, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the cold of it the whole way back. But here is the thing about the East Valley spur, and I didn't understand it until later. Pell needed water for his work crews and his steam, and the East Valley had none, and the only sweet water in 20 miles was under the salt on my South Parcel, the spring Dotest had taught me to dig below the lazy crust to find. Pell hadn't wanted my dead acres for the flat ground. Any flat ground would do. He'd wanted them for the spring he didn't even know was sweet. He'd have filled it without ever knowing what he was burying. When the East Valley work stalled for want of water that fall, and it did, I understood that the old woman's spring had been the prize all along, and that I'd very nearly sold the heart of the only living thing for miles to a man who'd have killed it by accident, for gravel. Most things that look dead are only poisoned at the mouth. I'd saved one of them without even knowing the size of what I'd saved. I didn't tell Dotest right away that I'd refused. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to keep it for myself a little while, the one clean thing I'd done. Maybe I was afraid she'd see something noble in me that I knew wasn't there. So I just kept riding out, and she kept tending the corn, and the harvest came on toward us through the last hot weeks of summer. It was Garrity who forced it into the open. The witch talk had grown all that summer, the way a sickness does in a starving place. By late August it wasn't just talk. There'd been a dead chicken left on a fence post near the parcel. There'd been mutterings at the church and at the dry goods store, the kind of mutterings that move through frightened people like a current looking for a place to ground itself. And Garrity, hollowed out by his griefs, filled up with bile, had become the thing the current grounded in. He came at night. He came with two other men whose names I'll keep out of this because they were sorry after, truly sorry, and a sorry man deserves at least the mercy of not being named in another man's book. They came with torches, on a dry wind, to the driest country in the world, to burn the witch corn out of the ground and feel like they'd done something against the drought that had eaten their lives. I saw the light from my window. You can see fire a long way at night in flat country, and there's only one direction that light could have meant. I was on my horse before I'd thought about it, riding hard through the dark, and I'll tell you my heart was a fist in my throat the whole way, because a fire in standing corn on a dry wind is the kind of thing that finishes in minutes. When I came up over the last rise I saw her. Dotest was in the rows. The men's torches were down at the south end, where they'd set the dry edge alight, and a line of fire was walking up into the green on the wind, and she was in front of it, an old woman alone, beating at the flames with a wet horse blanket she must have soaked at her spring, throwing dug dirt with her bare hands, moving down the line of her corn the same slow, sure way she did everything, except now it was against fire, and she was losing. You could see she was losing. The wind was faster than an old woman's arms. I came off my horse and into it. I don't remember deciding to. We fought it together. I had a saddle blanket and she had hers, and we beat and we smothered and we threw dirt, and the smoke was in everything and the heat took the hair off my arms, and Garrity and his two men stood at the edge in the torchlight and watched, frozen, the way men freeze when a thing they started gets bigger than the anger that started it. And then I have thought about this a great deal, and I still don't fully understand what moved in them. Garrity dropped his torch in the dirt and ran into the fire with us, just like that. The old man who'd called it witch corn, who'd spat in my dead ground, ran in beating at the flames he'd set with his own coat, weeping, I think, though it was hard to tell in the smoke. And his two men followed him. The four of us and the old woman, fighting in the dark to save the very thing three of us had come to kill. We saved most of it. Not all. The south third burned a black scar where the dry edge had been, the stalks there reduced to standing char. But the heart of the field lived, the spring lived, and when the wind finally turned off near dawn and the last of the fire died into smoking dirt, the five of us stood in the gray light filthy and burned and gasping, and nobody said a word for a long time. It was Garrity who finally spoke. He couldn't look at her. He looked at the ground, at the corn he'd nearly killed, and his voice came out cracked and small, an old man's voice with all the bile burned out of it. "My boys are gone west," he said to no one, to the dirt. "My wife's in the ground. I had to put it somewhere. I'm sorry. God forgive me, I had to put it somewhere." And he wept openly, the way grown men of that country never let themselves weep, and Dotest, I watched her do it. Dotest crossed the burned ground to him and put her old burned hand on his shaking shoulder, the man who'd come to destroy her life's last work, and she said something to him too low for me to hear, and whatever it was, he nodded, and he kept nodding, and something in him that had been clenched for years came loose. I wrote that night for the first time in weeks. I wrote it all down, every part of it, my hand steady for once, and at the end I wrote, "Garrity came to burn it and stayed to save it. I do not understand people. I have spent my whole life counting them, and I do not understand the first thing about them. That entry's still in the book. I read it when I forget." The valley came the next morning. Word travels. They came to see the burned field, and they found something they hadn't come for. They found Garrity, of all men, standing at the edge of the saved corn, telling anyone who'd listen about the spring, about digging below the salt, about the corn that knows thirst, repeating it the way the converted always do, louder than the people who never doubted. And Dotest, who had told me she'd given up teaching people who thought her beneath them, stood in her rows in the smoke-smelling dawn. And when the valley came to her this time, hungry and ashamed and finally empty enough to learn, she taught them. She taught them all that fall, how to find the sweet water under the lazy salt on their own ruined parcels, how to plant the old corn that remembered thirst, the seeds she had carried east in a hem of cloth and carried home again. She walked from ranch to ranch on her old cracked knees, slower every week, and she put the dark hard seeds into the hands of the people who'd called it witch corn, and she showed them how to press them into the dead ground with a thumb, one at a time, slow, like tucking children into bed. She was failing by then. I think she'd been failing all summer, and the fire had taken something out of her that didn't come back. She'd stop in the middle of a row and press her hand to her chest, not her back now, her chest, and stand a moment and go on. She would not stop going on. I asked her once to rest, to let the valley do the work she'd taught them, and she gave me a look that I have never forgotten and said, "Seeds are patient. I am not. There is too little of me left to waste any of it sitting," and she went back to her teaching. The harvest came in October. The first real harvest those dead acres had given in a generation, not large, not by the standards of a wet country, but real ears of dark corn pulled from poisoned ground, and from a dozen other parcels around the valley where the seeds had gone, smaller harvests. First harvests, the beginning of harvests, enough to eat, enough, most importantly, to save back for seed. 10 ears become 100, 100 become 1,000. She'd told me that the first week, and I'd thought she was speaking of corn, and I understand now she was speaking of something larger that I don't have a clean word for. She didn't see the 1,000. She'd told me she wouldn't, the very first morning, and she'd been right, the way she was right about nearly everything I doubted her on. She died in the winter, in a small house the valley built for her, the same people who'd called her a witch in July, raising the walls in November with their own hands because they didn't know how else to say what she'd given them. I sat with her some of those last nights. She didn't talk much by then. But one night near the end she was clearer, and she had me bring her the basket, the flat woven one, and in the bottom of it she'd saved back a handful of the dark seeds, the best of the harvest, and she pressed them into my hand and closed my fingers over them with both of her own. "Plant these in the spring," she said, "not in the good ground, in the worst ground you have left, always the worst ground. The good ground does not need us." She held my hand closed around the seeds. "And teach someone. That is the only part that matters. The corn will outlive both of us if someone always knows how. Promise me you will teach someone." I promised her. It's the only promise I've never once been tempted to break. She asked me, last of all, what I'd write in my book about her. I think she was teasing me a little, even then, even there. I told her I didn't know. I told her I'd spent my whole life counting, and that there wasn't a number for what she was, that I'd looked and never found where it went in the ledger. She smiled, that smile that cracked her whole face open like ground after rain, smaller now but the same, and she said, "Then leave the page white. Some things you do not count. Some things you only carry." And she closed her eyes, and a few days later she was gone, and I buried her in the south parcel at her asking, in the dead acres she'd brought back to life, near the spring that still runs sweet below the salt, where the corn comes up green every spring now over the place where she lies. It's been a long time since that year. The drought broke the next spring the way droughts do, with no fanfare and no apology, a wet March, a green April, the creek finding its old bed again like it had never left. The valley filled back up with the people who'd held on and some new ones besides. The railroad came eventually, up the East Valley, and it did fine without my spring, and Pell got rich, and that's the way of it. The good ground does not need us, she said. The good times don't either. But the corn stayed. That's the thing. When the rains came back, the soft yellow corn could have come back too, the easy corn that doesn't remember thirst, and a lot of farmers did go back to it because it grows fat and quick in a wet year. But there were those who didn't. There were those who'd learned what the old corn could do in the bad years and who never again wanted to be caught with nothing but seed that had forgotten how to suffer. They kept planting hers. They taught their children to. And when the next dry years came, and they always come, that's the one thing you can count on in this country. Those families had corn when the others had dust. That's what the title of this account means, if you've been waiting for me to say it plain. She grew the crop that changed everything. Not because it was magic. It wasn't magic. It was just old and tough, and it remembered something the rest of us had let ourselves forget. It changed everything because it changed the people who grew it. It taught a curdled, beaten valley that the thing they'd written off as dead was only poisoned at the mouth, and that you could dig below the bitterness to the sweet water if you were stubborn enough to disagree with what everybody knew. I'm an old man now. I kept my promise. I've taught more people to grow her corn than I can count, and I'm a man who counts, so that's saying something. I plant a patch of it every spring in the worst ground I own, the way she told me, and I save back the best of it, and I press the dark seeds in with my thumb, slow, one at a time, and I'm not ashamed any more of how that probably looks to a man riding by who doesn't know. I still keep the logbook, force of habit, but there's a page in it I've never filled near the front, where I tore the old page out that night. I leave it white. I know now what it's for. Some things you do not count. Some things you only carry and pass on and hope the carrying outlives you the way the seeds outlived the woman who carried them home in a hem of cloth across half a country, because she decided they should not be allowed to die even if she was. I think about her most in the spring, when the corn comes up green over the south parcel, over the dead acres that aren't dead, over the place where she lies near the sweet water. I never did find the number for her.